The mist hung low over Crickwater Hollow that autumn morning in 1941, shrouding the cluster of weathered homes that dotted the mountainside. 16-year-old Thomas Blackwell stood at the edge of his family's property, watching as the first rays of sunlight struggled to penetrate the fog. The Blackwell home sat isolated at the end of a winding dirt road, 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, deep in the Appalachian Mountains of eastern Kentucky. Thomas adjusted the worn suspenders over his faded flannel shirt and gazed toward the house where smoke curled from the chimney. His father Elias would be expecting him soon for their work in the coal mine, but Thomas lingered, savoring these last moments of solitude. Something had been gnawing at him lately, questions about his mother's death during childbirth, questions about why the townsfolk in nearby Crickwater whispered when he passed, and why his Aunt Clara, who had raised him, would sometimes look at him with tears welling in her eyes. Tommy. His father's voice echoed across the yard, rough as the mountains themselves. "Get on in here, boy." Thomas trudged toward the house, his boots heavy in the damp earth. Inside, Aunt Clara stood at the stove, her thin frame bent over a cast-iron pan of cornbread. At 42, she looked 20 years older, her face lined with worries that Thomas couldn't understand. "Mornin', Aunt Clara," Thomas muttered, taking his place at the worn wooden table. She didn't meet his eyes. "Your daddy needs you at the mine early today. The Rollins boy ain't coming in." Elias Blackwell entered the kitchen, his massive frame filling the doorway. At 53, he was still powerful, though years of coal dust had settled in his lungs, giving his breathing a raspy quality that worsened with each passing month. "You been standing out there wool gathering again?" Elias grumbled, pouring coffee into a chipped mug. "Got no time for daydreaming when there's coal to dig." "Yes, sir," Thomas replied, accepting the plate of food Aunt Clara slid before him. The tension in the room was palpable, as it had been for as long as Thomas could remember. His father rarely spoke beyond giving orders, and Aunt Clara, his father's sister who had moved in after his mother died, seemed to exist in a perpetual state of nervous exhaustion. As they ate in silence, Thomas noticed the way his father and aunt exchanged glances, furtive, laden with some unspoken burden. He'd seen these looks his entire life, but lately they stirred something uneasy in his gut. "Heard you was talking to that Harper girl after church," Elias said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. Thomas felt his face flush. "Just being friendly." "You stay away from them Harpers," his father warned, eyes narrowing. "Ain't no good gonna come from mixin' with folks from town." Aunt Clara's hand trembled slightly as she refilled Elias's coffee. "The boy's just growing up, Elias. Can't keep him isolated forever." "I can do what needs doing to protect this family," Elias snapped, causing Clara to flinch. Thomas pushed his eggs around his plate, appetite gone. The familiar feeling of being trapped, not just in these mountains, but in secrets he couldn't name, pressed down on him like the weight of stone. Later, as they walked the mile to the mine entrance, Thomas worked up his courage. "Pah, why don't we ever talk about my mother?" Elias stopped abruptly, his face hardening in the gray morning light. "What's brought this on? I'm 16 now. Seems I ought to know something about her." His father's eyes, the same deep blue as Thomas's own, clouded over. "She died bringing you into this world." Ain't much else to tell, but Thomas knew there was more. He'd found a small photograph hidden in his aunt's Bible, a young woman with his same prominent cheekbones and dark hair, standing next to his aunt. On the back, in faded pencil, "Clara and Margaret, 1924. Was her name Margaret? Thomas pressed. Elias's hand shot out, gripping Thomas's arm with bruising force. "You been snooping? What did you find?" "Nothin'," Thomas lied, fear creeping up his spine at the wild look in his father's eyes. "Just heard Pastor Miller mention that name once." Elias released him, but the dangerous edge remained in his voice. "Some things are best left buried, boy. Remember that." As they descended into the darkness of the mine, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that the true darkness he needed to fear wasn't in these coal seams, but in the secrets his family had buried, secrets that, like the mountains themselves, cast long shadows over everything. Saturday morning found Thomas in Crickwater for the weekly supply run. The small-town center consisted of Milligan's General Store, the post office, a one-room schoolhouse Thomas had stopped attending 2 years prior, and the white clapboard church where the Blackwells made their obligatory Sunday appearances. Inside Milligan's, Thomas handed over his aunt's carefully written list to Mr. Milligan, a stout man with thinning hair who had owned the store for as long as anyone could remember. As the shopkeeper gathered flour and sugar, Thomas noticed 2 women by the fabric counter, their voices dropping to whispers when they spotted him. "That's the Blackwell boy," one murmured, not quite quietly enough. "Lord of mercy," the other replied, making a subtle sign of the cross. Heat rose to Thomas's face. This wasn't the first time he'd noticed such reactions, but they seemed to be happening more frequently as he grew older and as he came to resemble his father. more with each passing month. Mr. Milligan cleared his throat. That'll be $4.17. Tommy. As Thomas counted out the money from the worn leather pouch Aunt Clara had given him, the bell above the door jingled and Sheriff Roy Tate entered. The sheriff's gaze immediately found Thomas, his expression unreadable beneath his neatly trimmed mustache. "Mornin', Tommy," the sheriff said, nodding curtly. "Your daddy at the mine today?" "Yes, sir," Thomas replied, gathering the paper-wrapped packages into his arms. "Tell him I'll be by next week about that property line matter with the Hendersons." Thomas nodded, eager to escape the store's suddenly oppressive atmosphere. Outside, he paused on the wooden sidewalk, shifting the packages to get a better grip. A voice called his name, and he turned to see Emma Harper approaching, her blue dress matching her eyes, blonde hair neatly braided. "Hello, Thomas," she said, smiling. At 15, Emma was the daughter of the town doctor and one of the few people in Crickwater who treated Thomas normally. "Are you coming to the Harvest Social next weekend?" Before Thomas could answer, Dr. Harper appeared in the doorway of his office across the street. "Emma," he called sharply. "Come here, please." Emma's smile faltered. "I should go. Maybe I'll see you at church tomorrow." As she hurried away, Thomas noticed Dr. Harper's stern gaze following him. The physician's lips were pressed into a tight line of disapproval as he ushered his daughter inside. Thomas began the long walk home, his mind churning. The townsfolk's reactions weren't new, but his growing awareness of them was becoming unbearable. What could his family have done to earn such quiet disdain? Halfway home, Thomas stopped at Widow Jenkins's small cabin to deliver her monthly package of coffee and tobacco, a task Aunt Clara always insisted upon. The elderly woman had been a midwife before arthritis gnarled her hands, and she delivered most of Crickwater's children, including Thomas himself. "Come in, boy," she called when he knocked. The cabin smelled of herbs and wood smoke. Widow Jenkins sat in her rocking chair by the window, her white hair pulled back in a severe bun. "Aunt Clara sent these," Thomas said, placing the items on her small table. The old woman's eyes, still sharp despite her 80 years, studied him intently. "You look more like your mama every day," she said unexpectedly. Thomas froze. "You knew my mother?" "Course I did." "Delivered you, didn't I?" She continued, rocking the chair, creaking rhythmically. "Shame what happened." "Pure shame." Thomas's heart raced. "What happened? To my mother?" Widow Jenkins's expression shifted as if realizing she'd said too much. "Nothing for young ears. Your aunt and daddy will tell you when they're ready." "But they won't talk about her," Thomas insisted, seizing this rare opportunity. "I don't even know what she looked like except for one old photograph." The old woman sighed, her roomy eyes suddenly filled with something like pity. "Some sins cast long shadows, boy. Sometimes the truth hurts worse than not knowing." "What sins?" Thomas pressed, but Widow Jenkins shook her head firmly. "Not my place. But mark my words, this hollow has secrets deep as the mine shafts, and just as dangerous if disturbed." She reached for her pipe, a clear dismissal. "Thank your aunt for the tobacco. And Thomas," she added as he turned to leave, "be careful about stirring up the past. Some things once known can't be unknown." The walk home seemed longer than usual, Widow Jenkins's cryptic warning echoing in Thomas's mind. The packages grew heavy in his arms, but the burden of unanswered questions weighed far more. Coco? As he crested the final hill overlooking the Blackwell property, Thomas made a decision. Tonight, after his father and aunt were asleep, he would search the house for answers. Whatever dark secret his family was keeping, he had a right to know. After all, how bad could the truth really be? Midnight found Thomas creeping through the darkened house, a single candle cupped in his palm to shield the flame. His father's snores rumbled from the bedroom downstairs, while Aunt Clara slept in the small room off the kitchen. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he made his way to the attic stairs. The narrow staircase led to a low-ceilinged space beneath the eaves, filled with dust-covered trunks and forgotten furniture. Thomas had only been up here a handful of times, always supervised by his aunt for specific errands. He recalled seeing her hurriedly close a trunk once when he'd come up unexpectedly. That memory had lingered, and now it drew him to the far corner where the trunk sat beneath a small window. The brass lock gleamed dully in the candlelight. Thomas set the candle down and retrieved the bent wire he'd prepared earlier. Remembering the techniques Jeb Simmons had taught the boys behind the schoolhouse years ago, after several tense minutes of fumbling, the lock finally gave way with a soft click. Thomas lifted the heavy lid slowly, wincing at the creak of old hinges. Inside lay neatly folded women's clothing dresses in faded floral prints, a blue cardigan, items he assumed had belonged to his mother. Carefully he lifted them out, noting the lingering scent of cedar and something else, a faint floral perfume preserved all these years. Beneath the clothing he found a small wooden box, intricately carved with wildflowers. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, revealing a collection of treasures. A silver hairbrush with a few dark hairs still caught in the bristles, a tarnished locket, and a small stack of letters tied with faded ribbon. Thomas hesitated, aware that he was crossing a line from which he couldn't return. But the need to know overwhelmed his hesitation. He untied the ribbon and opened the first letter, dated June 1924. Dearest Clara, I write with a heavy heart as father has forbidden me to see Joseph again. He says no daughter of his will run off with a coal miner's son. I cry myself to sleep most nights thinking of Joseph's smile and how his hands felt in mine as we walked by the creek. Thomas frowned in confusion. This seemed to be a love letter from his mother to his Aunt Clara, not his father. He moved to the next letter, dated October 1924. My darling Clara, I cannot bear this separation any longer. Joseph and I have made plans to elope next month. I know father will disown me, but I would rather live in poverty with the man I love than in this gilded cage. Please don't tell anyone. I fear what father might do if he discovered our plan. Your devoted sister, Margaret's sister. The words struck Thomas like a physical blow. Margaret wasn't writing to Clara, she was Clara's sister. His mother was his aunt's sister. But that meant... With growing dread, Thomas rifled through the remaining letters, finding one dated April 1925 that made his blood run cold. Clara, I write in desperation. Joseph died in the mine collapse last week, and I've just discovered I'm with child. Father will kill me if he learns I'm carrying a dead miner's bastard. Please, I beg you, let me come stay with you until the baby's born. Your brother Elias barely knows me. I was away at school most times he visited. He need never know the truth. The candle flickered as Thomas's hands began to shake violently. His mother was Margaret, Clara's sister. But then who was his father? Not Elias, clearly, but a miner named Joseph who died before he was born. Yet everyone in Crickwater knew him as Elias Blackwell's son. Thomas frantically searched through the remaining letters, finding one final note dated October 1925, just a month before his birth. Clara, Elias knows. God help me, he found the letters Joseph wrote me. The look in his eyes, I've never seen such rage. He says if I try to leave, he'll tell everyone in the county that I'm carrying a bastard. He says the only solution is for us to marry quickly and pretend the child is his, born early. Clara, I'm afraid of your brother. There's something not right in him, the way he looks at me, The letter ended abruptly as if Margaret had been interrupted while writing. It was the last one in the stack. Thomas sat back on his heels, the implications crashing over him in waves. Elias wasn't his father. His real father had died before he was born. Margaret, his mother, had been forced to marry Elias to avoid scandal. And Aunt Clara was actually his mother's sister, making her truly his aunt. But why did everyone think Elias was his father? What had happened to Margaret? A floorboard creaked behind him. Thomas whirled around, heart hammering, to find Aunt Clara standing at the top of the attic stairs, her nightgown ghostly in the dim light, her face a mask of horror as she took in the open trunk and the letters scattered around Thomas. What have you done? She whispered, her voice breaking. Oh, Thomas, what have you done? Tell me the truth, Thomas demanded, rising to his feet, the letters clutched in his hand. Who was my mother? What happened to her? Clara's shoulders sagged as if the weight of 16 years had suddenly become too much to bear. She moved slowly toward an old rocking chair in the corner, lowering herself into it with the deliberate care of someone whose bones ached with secrets. Margaret was my little sister, she began, her voice barely audible above the whistling wind outside the attic window. She was the pretty one, the smart one. Father sent her to a ladies' school in Lexington while I stayed home to help Mother with the house. Thomas remained standing, afraid that if he moved or spoke, Clara might stop talking. She continued, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the attic walls. When Margaret came home after graduation, she met Joseph Alderman at a church social. He worked in the mine with Elias, but he was different, gentle, educated despite his poor upbringing. They fell in love, but Father forbade it. Joseph wasn't good enough for his prized daughter. Clara's fingers twisted in her lap. They planned to elope, but there was a collapse in the eastern tunnel. Joseph and 11 others died. A week later, Margaret discovered she was expecting you. So Elias isn't my father, Thomas said, the words strange on his tongue. No, Clara confirmed. Joseph Alderman was your real father. Margaret came to me, desperate. Our father would have thrown her out if he discovered her condition. I brought her here to stay with me. Elias had built this house after our parents died, and I kept house for him. He was gone most days at the mine, so I thought it would be safe. A terrible suspicion was forming in Thomas's mind. What happened then? Clara closed her eyes. Elias found letters Joseph had written to Margaret. He'd always been possessive of things he considered his, including this house, including me. But when he saw Margaret so beautiful, so refined despite her circumstance, something changed in him. Her voice dropped even lower. He told her no one would marry a fallen woman carrying another man's child, but he would. He said he'd claim the baby as his own, born early, and her reputation would be saved. When she refused, Clara's voice broke. When she refused what? Thomas pressed, though part of him didn't want to hear the answer. He threatened to tell everyone about the baby, to ruin her completely. And he threatened me too, said he'd put me out with nowhere to go. In those days, an unmarried woman my age had few options. Clara's hands trembled. Margaret agreed to marry him for my sake as much as hers. The ceremony was small, just us and the preacher from 2 counties over. Thomas felt sick. And my mother? What happened to her? Clara finally met his eyes, tears streaming down her weathered face. Childbirth, like they told you. But double quotes, she hesitated. It wasn't the whole truth. The labor was difficult. Margaret hemorrhaged badly. I sent Elias for the doctor, but he took too long. By the time Dr. Harper arrived, she had lost too much blood. He let her die, Thomas whispered, the horrifying realization dawning. Clara didn't deny it. I can't prove it, but I believe he delayed intentionally. He'd grown more controlling during the pregnancy, keeping her isolated, becoming enraged when she mentioned leaving after the baby came. When she died, Clara swallowed hard. A part of him seemed relieved. He had his son in the eyes of the law and the community, and he was free of a wife who never loved him. Why didn't you tell anyone? Report him to the sheriff? Thomas demanded, anger rising through his shock. Who would believe me over him? Elias was respected in the community, a hard-working miner. And what proof did I have? Clara's voice strengthened. Besides, there was you to consider. You were all I had left of Margaret. If I'd accused Elias, you would have been taken away, labeled a bastard. I couldn't bear to lose you too. So I stayed to raise you as best I could, to keep Margaret's memory alive somehow. Thomas sank to the floor, the letters falling from his numb fingers. All his life he'd lived under the same roof as the man who had essentially caused his mother's death, who had forced her into marriage, who had stolen her chance at life. And this man had claimed to be his father. Does he know that I know none of this? Thomas asked, his voice hollow. I don't think so, Clara replied. He believes those letters were burned years ago. I couldn't bring myself to destroy Margaret's words. They're all that's left of her. A terrible thought struck Thomas. The way people look at me in town, They suspect something, don't they? Clara nodded slowly. Small towns have long memories. Margaret's return and hasty marriage to Elias raised eyebrows. The timing of your birth caused talk. Most folks counted the months and drew their own conclusions, though no one dared say anything openly. And Dr. Harper? He knows too? He was there that night. He saw how long it took Elias to fetch him, saw Margaret's condition. Clara wiped her tears with the back of her hand. He never said a word against Elias directly, but he knows. Thomas stood abruptly. I have to leave this place. I can't stay here another day, not with him. Thomas, wait, Clara began, but the sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs below cut her off. What in hell's going on up here? Elias's voice boomed from the stairwell. Clara? Boy? Why are you skulking around in the middle of the night? Clara's face drained of color. He can't find these, she whispered urgently, gesturing to the scattered letters. Quickly, help me, but it was too late. Elias's massive frame appeared at the top of the stairs, his eyes moving from Clara to Thomas to the open trunk and the letters on the floor. In the flickering candlelight, Thomas saw his expression transform from confusion to understanding to cold, calculated rage. So, Elias said, his voice deceptively quiet, you've been keeping secrets, sister. And you, boy, his eyes locked onto Thomas, you've been poking your nose where it don't belong. He took a step forward, and Thomas instinctively moved between Clara and the advancing figure of the only father he'd ever known. A father who was, in truth, no relation to him at all. Get away from her, Thomas said, his voice steadier than he felt as Elias advanced into the attic. Elias stopped, his eyes narrowing at Thomas's defiance. You giving me orders in my own house, boy? He glanced at the letters scattered across the floor. I see you've been filling your head with lies. They ain't lies, Thomas shot back. I know everything about my real father, about what you did to my mother. Elias's laugh was harsh in the confined space. Your real father? Joseph Alderman wasn't fit to call himself a man. Couldn't even keep himself alive in the mine. And as for your mother, his face twisted, she came to me. Ruined goods, carrying another man's bastard. Clara rose from the rocking chair. That's not true, Elias, and you know it. You forced her. You threatened us both. I saved her from disgrace, Elias snarled. Gave her a roof. Gave her name to her bastard child. And this is the thanks I get? The two of you conspiring against me? Thomas felt rage building inside him, rage for the mother he'd never known. For the years of living under this man's thumb, for the way Clara had been forced to live in fear. You let her die, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You could have saved her, but you let her die. Something flickered in Ilias's eyes, not guilt, but a cold calculation. Prove it, he challenged. Ain't nobody going to take the word of a woman and a bastard over mine. The whole town suspects, Clara said. They've always suspected. Suspicion ain't proof, Elias countered. He turned his attention back to Thomas. You think you can leave? Where would you go? Who'd take in Joseph Alderman's bastard? Anywhere's better than here with you, Thomas replied. Ilias's face darkened. You ain't going nowhere. Neither of you. He moved toward the trunk, reaching for the letters. Time these were burned like they should have been years ago. Thomas stepped forward, blocking his path. Don't touch them. For a moment they stood face to face. Thomas, at 16, nearly as tall as Elias now, but still lacking the older man's bulk and power. Ilias's eyes, so similar to Thomas's own despite their lack of blood relation, assessed him coldly. You think you're a man now? Elias asked softly. Think you can stand against me? Before Thomas could react, Ilias's fist shot out, catching him in the stomach. Thomas doubled over, gasping for breath as Elias moved past him toward the letters. No, Clara cried, lunging forward to gather the precious papers. Elias backhanded her, sending her sprawling against the rocking chair, which toppled with a crash. The sight of Clara, the woman who had raised him, who had protected him as best she could, crumpled on the floor, ignited something primal in Thomas. With a roar, he launched himself at Elias, driving his shoulder into the older man's midsection. Caught off guard, Elias stumbled backward toward the attic stairs. For a moment he teetered at the edge, his arms windmilling as he fought for balance. Then, with a look of surprise that quickly morphed to rage, he fell. The sickening thud of his body hitting each step echoed through the house, followed by a final, heavy impact at the bottom. Then silence. Thomas stood frozen at the top of the stairs, unable to process what had just happened. Clara scrambled to her feet and pushed past him, hurrying down the stairs. After a moment, Thomas followed, his legs moving mechanically. Elias lay at the bottom of the stairs, his neck bent at an unnatural angle, eyes open and staring at nothing. Clara knelt beside him, her fingers pressed to his throat, though it was clear from the stillness of his chest that he was gone. Is he? Thomas couldn't finish the question. Clara nodded, her face ashen. He's dead. She looked up at Thomas, her eyes wide with shock and something else, a terrible kind of relief. Thomas, what have we done? He fell, Thomas said numbly. I didn't push him. He lost his balance. Clara rose slowly, her gaze moving from Ilias's body to Thomas. No one will believe that. Not with what they already think of us of you. The implications hit Thomas like a physical blow. The suspicious townsfolk. The way Dr. Harper had looked at him. The whispers that had followed him his entire life. Now with Elias dead at the bottom of the stairs after a confrontation, who would believe it was an accident? We have to go, Clara said suddenly, her voice taking on a new urgency. Pack only what you need. We'll take the Ford and be gone before dawn. Gone where? Thomas asked, still staring at Ilias's body. West, Clara replied, far as we can get. California, maybe? No one knows us there. We can start fresh. She gripped his shoulders. Thomas, look at me. We have no choice. If we stay, they'll hang you for this, accident or not. The reality of their situation began to penetrate Thomas's shock. Elias was dead. He and Clara were alone in this isolated house with a body and a trunk full of evidence pointing to a 16-year-old scandal, a scandal that had just turned deadly. Get your things, Clara instructed, suddenly all business. Only what you can carry. I'll get some food together and the emergency money Elias kept in the coffee tin. Meet me at the truck in 15 minutes. As Clara hurried to the kitchen, Thomas took one last look at the man who had claimed to be his father. In death, Elias looked smaller somehow, less imposing than the figure who had dominated Thomas's life. A mixture of emotions washed over him, grief not for Elias, but for the father he'd never known, for the mother whose face he'd only seen in one faded photograph, for the life he might have had if Joseph Alderman had lived and Margaret hadn't died. Then, turning away from the past that lay broken at the foot of the stairs, Thomas went to prepare for a future he couldn't begin to imagine. The Ford truck's engine sputtered to life in the pre-dawn darkness, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet hollow. Thomas sat behind the wheel, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted the choke. Clara had taught him to drive last summer when Elias was laid up with a mining injury, but he'd never driven at night, never gone further than the general store in Crickwater. Clara emerged from the house, carrying a small valise and a cloth sack that clinked with the sound of canning jars. She slid into the passenger seat, her face set with determination. "Drive slow until we're past the Henderson place," she instructed. "Then take the county road east toward Jackson. We need to be well away from here before anybody comes looking." Thomas nodded, putting the truck in gear. As they pulled away from the only home he'd ever known, he couldn't help glancing in the rearview mirror. The house stood dark and silent, holding its new secret. "What if someone finds him before we're gone?" Thomas asked, voicing the fear that had been building since they'd made their hasty plans. "Nobody comes to check on Elias," Clara replied, her voice flat. "The mine foreman might send someone if he doesn't show up for a couple of days, but by then we'll be far away." They drove in silence for a while, the truck's headlights cutting a narrow path through the darkness. The road wound down from the hollow into deeper countryside, the mountains looming like sentinels on either side. "Should we bury him?" Thomas asked suddenly, the thought hitting him with fresh horror. "Just leaving him there seems ... What would you have us do?" Clara interrupted sharply. "Dig a grave in the rocky soil, in the dark, with no explanation for why we're doing it? Then run anyway?" She shook her head. "Better they find him at the bottom of the stairs. An accident. A tragedy. Nothing more." But they both knew it wouldn't be seen that way. The timing was too convenient, the circumstances too suspicious. Even now, Thomas could imagine Sheriff Tate standing in their living room, piecing together what had happened, the confrontation, the fall, the flight. It would confirm everything the townsfolk had whispered about the Blackwells for years. As they approached the turnoff to the county road, Thomas saw headlights in the distance, coming toward them. His heart seized. "Someone's coming," he said, slow in the truck. Clara gripped his arm. "Keep driving, normal speed. It's probably just someone heading to an early shift at the mine." Thomas forced himself to breathe normally as the approaching vehicle of the truck drew closer. In the brief moment as they passed each other, he recognized Hank Mueller, who worked the morning shift at the coal processing plant. Thomas nodded automatically, the way he always did when passing someone on the road. Mueller lifted a hand in response, his expression hidden in the darkness of his cab. Then he was past them, continuing up toward the hollow. "He didn't look suspicious," Thomas said, exhaling slowly. "No reason he should," Clara replied, though the tension in her voice betrayed her own fear. "Just two people driving in the early morning. Nothing strange about that." But Thomas knew it wasn't normal for the Blackwells to be out driving before dawn, especially with Clara along. If Mueller mentioned seeing them to anyone after Elias was found, they reached the county road and turned east as planned. The way was clearer here, the road wider and better maintained. Thomas pressed the accelerator, eager to put as much distance as possible between themselves and Crickwater Hollow. "Where exactly are we going?" he asked after they'd driven in silence for several miles. Clara stared out the window at the passing countryside, just beginning to emerge from darkness. "My cousin Meredith lives in Cincinnati. We can stay with her for a few days while we figure things out. After that, I don't know. West, like I said, somewhere no one knows us. Will Meredith help us?" After ... bulk quotes, Thomas couldn't finish the sentence. "She doesn't know about any of it," Clara said. "She left Kentucky before Margaret came to stay with us. As far as she knows, Elias was your father and Margaret died in childbirth. Simple as that." The simplicity of the lie struck Thomas anew. For 16 years he'd lived a life built on falsehoods about his parentage, about his mother's death, about who he really was. Now he was fleeing into a future that would require even more lies. "I'm not sorry he's dead," Thomas said suddenly, the words bursting from him. "Does that make me a bad person?" Clara was quiet for a long moment. "I'm not sorry either," she finally admitted. "I spent 16 years being afraid of my own brother, watching him control our lives, knowing what he did to Margaret. But being glad someone's dead and killing them are two different things, Thomas. You didn't kill him. He fell. Remember that." But the line between accident and intent seemed to blur in Thomas's mind as the events replayed. Had he meant for Elias to fall when he charged at him? Had some part of him in that moment of rage wanted exactly what had happened? The sky was lightening to a pearly gray when they reached the outskirts of Jackson. Clara directed him to a diner just off the main road, its windows glowing yellow in the early morning. "We should eat something," she said, "and I need coffee if I'm going to navigate us to Cincinnati." Thomas parked the truck and cut the engine. The sudden silence was jarring after hours of mechanical rumble. "What if someone recognizes us?" he asked, eyeing the diner wearily. "No one from Crickwater comes this far except for Christmas shopping," Clara replied. "And even if they did, they don't know anything's wrong yet. We're just a woman and her nephew stopping for breakfast." Nephew. The word hit Thomas strangely. All his life, Clara had been Aunt Clara, but he'd thought of her as a stand-in mother. Now he knew she truly was his aunt, his mother's sister, while the man he'd called father was no relation at all. Inside the diner, a few early patrons sat at the counter, truck drivers mostly, and a couple of men in work clothes. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, barely glanced at them as she took their order: eggs, toast, coffee for Clara, milk for Thomas. As they waited for their food, Thomas noticed a newspaper on a nearby empty stool. The headline caught his eye: "War rages in Europe. U.S. naval vessels fired upon." The date was yesterday's. "The war," Thomas said quietly. "I could enlist." Clara's head snapped up. "What are you talking about?" "If we're running anyway," Thomas continued, his voice low, "I could join up. I'm 16, but I could say I'm 18. Lots of boys do it." "Absolutely not," Clara hissed, her knuckles white around her coffee cup. "I didn't save you from one death to send you off to another." "But it would solve everything," Thomas insisted. "You could go to your cousins, say I ran off to enlist. It wouldn't be a lie, not really. And nobody looks too hard for a boy who's gone to war." The waitress arrived with their food, silencing the conversation momentarily. When she left, Clara leaned forward, her expression fierce. "Listen to me, Thomas. Your mother died bringing you into this world. I've spent 16 years trying to protect you from Elias, from the town's judgment, from everything. I'm not about to let you throw your life away now." Thomas pushed his eggs around his plate. "What kind of life will I have as a fugitive? Always looking over my shoulder, wondering if someone from Crickwater will recognize me." "A life," Clara insisted. "A chance to become the man Joseph Alderman's son was meant to be, not what Elias tried to make you." The mention of his real father struck Thomas deeply. Joseph Alderman, a name he'd only learned hours ago, a ghost he'd never known. What kind of man had he been, this miner who'd loved Margaret enough to plan an elopement, who'd died before knowing he'd fathered a son? "Tell me about him," Thomas said suddenly. "My real father. What was he like?" Clara's expression softened. Joseph was nothing like Elias. He was quieter, thoughtful. He'd been to school, not much, but enough to love reading. Always had a book in his pocket, even down in the mine. The other men teased him for it, but not maliciously. She smiled faintly at the memory. "He had your eyes, or rather you have his. And that way you have of thinking before you speak, that's him too." "Did he love her? My mother?" "More than anything," Clara said without hesitation. "He used to walk 5 miles after a 12-hour shift just to spend a few minutes with her by the creek where they'd meet in secret. He was saving every penny to buy them a little house in Lexington, away from the mines." Thomas tried to imagine this man, his father, trudging miles after a day of back-breaking work, driven by love. It was a stark contrast to Elias, who'd rarely shown affection to anyone. "Would he have been a good father, do you think?" Thomas asked, his voice small. Clara reached across the table and took his hand. "The best. He was so excited when Margaret told him about you. Said it was like God was giving him a family to replace the one he'd lost as a boy." Thomas blinked back sudden tears. All these years, he'd believed himself the son of a hard, cruel man, only to discover his true father had been someone worthy of remembrance, of pride. "Then I won't enlist," he said finally. "At least not yet. Not until we're safe." Relief washed over Clara's face. "We'll figure this out, Thomas. One step at a time." They finished their meal in silence, both lost in thoughts of the past and uncertain future. As Clara paid the bill, Thomas noticed a man at the counter watching them in the mirror behind the cash register. When their eyes met in the reflection, the man quickly looked away, but something about his interest made Thomas uneasy. Sighed, the day had fully dawned, the September sun cutting through the morning mist. Thomas started the truck while Clara studied a wrinkled road map. "We'll take Route 52 north," she said. "Should get us to Cincinnati by mid-afternoon if we don't run into trouble." As they pulled onto the main road, Thomas checked the rearview mirror. A dark sedan was leaving the diner parking lot, turning onto the road behind them. "I think someone's following us," he said, his mouth suddenly dry. Clara twisted in her seat to look. "It's just someone leaving the diner, same as us." "Don't get jumpy, Thomas. That'll draw more attention than anything." Thomas forced himself to drive normally, but kept checking the mirror. The sedan maintained a consistent distance behind them for the next several miles. "He's still there," Thomas said as they approached a crossroads. "Turn right here," Clara instructed. "It's not our route, but let's see if he follows." Thomas made the turn. The sedan did the same. Clara's face paled. "Maybe it's just a coincidence. This road goes to Flemingsburg. It's a common enough route." But when they made another deliberate detour and the sedan remained behind them, there could be no more doubt. "Who is he?" Thomas asked, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. "How could anyone know about Elias already?" "I don't think they do," Clara said, her voice tight with fear. "But that man in the diner he was looking at us strangely. Maybe he recognized us from somewhere. Or maybe Mueller mentioned seeing us on the road this morning, and someone put it together when they found Elias, Thomas suggested, his imagination racing ahead to the worst scenarios. We can't know that, Clara said firmly. And we can't panic. Just keep driving. We'll lose them somehow. But as the miles passed, the sedan remained a constant presence behind them. Thomas's palms were slick with sweat on the wheel, his heart hammering in his chest. Every curve in the road, every hill they crested brought the fear that they'd find a roadblock waiting, Sheriff Tate standing with arms crossed, ready to take Thomas away in handcuffs. There's a train station in Maysville, Clara said suddenly. If we can get there, we could abandon the truck and take the train instead. They'd be looking for the Ford, not two passengers on a northbound train. Thomas nodded, the plan making sense. How far to Maysville? About 30 miles, I think. We can make it before noon if we keep this pace. But as they rounded the next bend, Thomas's blood ran cold. A county sheriff's car sat at the side of the road ahead, and an officer was standing beside it, apparently checking something on his front tire. "Clara," Thomas whispered, nodding toward the patrol car. "Just drive normally," she hissed. "He's not looking for us. He's just checking his tire." Thomas forced himself to maintain speed to keep his face neutral as they approached the sheriff's car. The officer glanced up as they passed, his expression unreadable behind mirrored sunglasses. In the rearview mirror, Thomas saw the dark sedan slow as it passed the sheriff's car as well. A moment later, the patrol car's engine started, and it pulled onto the road behind the sedan. "They're both following us now," Thomas said, panic rising in his voice. "We don't know that," Clara insisted, but her face had gone ashen. The officer might just be heading the same way, but when the patrol car's lights suddenly flashed on, there could be no more pretense. "They know," Thomas said, his voice hollow. "Somehow they already know about Elias." Clara's hand clutched at the door handle. "What do we do?" The patrol car had moved around the sedan now and was gaining on them rapidly. The decision crystallized in Thomas's mind with sudden clarity. "We run." Thomas floored the accelerator, the old Ford truck protesting with a mechanical whine as it struggled to increase speed. The patrol car's siren wailed to life behind them, its lights flashing urgently in the morning sunlight. "Thomas, no," Clara cried, bracing herself against the dashboard as the truck lurched forward. "We can't outrun them." "We have to try," Thomas replied through gritted teeth, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The speedometer crept upward 45-50 miles per hour. The truck shuddered dangerously, never meant to be pushed so hard. In the rearview mirror, Thomas could see the patrol car gaining on them, the dark sedan falling behind. The road ahead curved sharply around the shoulder of a hill, with a steep drop-off to the right. "Thomas, please," Clara begged. "This is madness. If we crash, we'll both die." But all Thomas could see was the image of a jail cell, of a hangman's noose, of everything he'd discovered about his true parentage being dragged into public view. They'd call him not just a murderer, but a bastard who killed his mother's husband. No court in Kentucky would show mercy. The curve approached rapidly. Thomas eased off the gas slightly, trying to maintain control as he navigated the bend. The truck's tires squealed in protest, the rear end fishtailing dangerously close to the edge of the road. Clara screamed, clutching the seat with white-knuckled hands. They made it through the curve, but the patrol car was right behind them now, close enough that Thomas could see the officer's determined face in the mirror. The road straightened briefly before another bend appeared ahead, this one sharper, with no guardrail protecting the drop beyond. "I can't do this," Thomas said suddenly, the reality of their situation crashing over him. "We're going to get ourselves killed." He began to ease off the accelerator, the truck slowing as resignation replaced panic. They couldn't outrun the law, not in this truck, not on these mountain roads. Whatever was waiting for them, they would have to face it. The patrol car pulled alongside them, the officer gesturing forcefully for Thomas to pull over. Thomas nodded, steering toward the shoulder of the road, the fight gone out of him. As the truck came to a stop, dust billowing around them, Thomas turned to Clara. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I never meant for any of this to happen." Clara reached across the seat, taking his hand in both of hers. "Whatever comes next, we face it together. I promised your mother I'd protect you, and I won't stop now." The officer approached cautiously, one hand resting on his holstered pistol. Thomas rolled down the window, trying to keep his breathing steady. "License and registration," the officer said gruffly. He was younger than Thomas had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with a thin mustache and serious eyes. I don't have a license, sir," Thomas admitted. "I'm only 16, the officer frowned. "Step out of the vehicle, both of you." Thomas and Clara complied, standing nervously by the side of the road as the dark sedan that had been following them pulled up behind the patrol car. A man in a plain suit emerged, the same man Thomas had noticed watching them in the diner. These the ones, Jenkins? The officer asked the suited man. Jenkins nodded, approaching slowly. That's them. Been trailing them since Jackson. Suspicious behavior, just like the bulletin said. Thomas's heart sank. So it was true. They already knew about Elias. Word had somehow gotten out faster than they could run. What's your name, son? The officer asked Thomas. Thomas Blackwell, he replied, seeing no point in lying. The officer's eyebrows rose slightly. Blackwell? From Crickwater Hollow? Thomas nodded, steeling himself for what would come next. The accusations, the handcuffs, the end of his brief attempt at escape. But instead, the officer turned to Jenkins with a puzzled expression. What's this about, then? The bulletin was for a Carson Duffy, and a woman matching her description. He gestured toward Clara. Said they robbed a store in Harlan County yesterday, and were headed north. Thomas felt the world tilt beneath him. They weren't looking for him and Clara at all. It was a case of mistaken identity. Jenkins had been following the wrong people. Clara recovered first. Officer, I'm Clara Blackwell, and this is my nephew, Thomas. We're on our way to Cincinnati to visit my cousin who's been taken ill. Thomas doesn't have a license, that's true, and I apologize for allowing him to drive. It was foolish of me. The officer studied them both carefully. Why'd you run then when I put on my lights? We panicked, Clara said before Thomas could speak. I was afraid Thomas would get in trouble for driving without a license. It was a stupid thing to do, and I take full responsibility. Jenkins looked dissatisfied. They matched the description, Barton. Woman in her 40s, boy about 16, driving an old Ford truck. Do you have the bulletin with you? The officer Barton asked. Jenkins reached into his jacket and produced a folded paper. Barton studied it, then looked back at Thomas and Clara. Says here the woman has a scar on her right cheek, he noted. I don't see any scar on Mrs. Blackwell here. Jenkins frowned, examining Clara more closely. It was dark in the diner. I could have missed it. And the boy is described as having red hair, Barton continued. This young man's hair is dark as coal. The tension in Thomas's shoulders began to ease slightly. By some miracle, they were being mistaken for different fugitives entirely. Where did you folks spend the night? Barton asked, his tone more conversational now. At home in Crickwater Hollow, Clara replied smoothly. We left before dawn to get an early start. Anyone who can verify that? Clara hesitated only a moment. My brother Elias was still asleep when we left. He works the late shift at the mine. Thomas marveled at how easily the lie came to her lips. Technically, it wasn't even a lie. Elias had indeed been in the house when they left. Just not asleep. Barton seemed satisfied, but Jenkins still looked suspicious. Why were you taking those back roads after Jackson if you're headed to Cincinnati? I thought it would be a more scenic route, Clara said. I wanted to show Thomas some of the countryside he's never seen. Barton handed the bulletin back to Jenkins. I don't think these are fugitives, Jenkins. The descriptions don't match well enough. Jenkins scowled, but didn't argue. Maybe not, but there's something off about them. Barton turned back to Thomas and Clara. I'm going to let you off with a warning about driving without a license, son, but I can't let you continue driving. Either your aunt takes the wheel, or you'll have to come with me to the station until we can arrange other transportation. I'll drive, Clara said quickly. It won't happen again, officer. Thank you for your understanding. Thomas moved around to the passenger side, hardly daring to believe their luck. As Clara settled behind the wheel, Barton leaned down to the window. One more thing, he said, his voice lower. There was a call came through on the radio while I was talking to you. Something about a disturbance in Crickwater Hollow. You folks know anything about that? Thomas felt his blood freeze in his veins, but Clara's expression remained perfectly composed. No, sir, she replied. Everything was quiet when we left. What kind of disturbance? Barton shrugged. Details were sketchy. Just thought I'd ask, since you're from there. Well, I hope it's nothing serious, Clara said, starting the engine. Thank you again, officer. As they pulled away, Thomas watched in the side mirror as Barton and Jenkins stood talking by their vehicles. Neither made a move to follow them. They know, Thomas whispered once they were a safe distance away. That call about a disturbance in Crickwater, someone must have found Elias. Maybe, Clara conceded, her voice tight, or maybe it was something else entirely. Either way, we can't go back now. We have to keep moving forward. They drove in tense silence for several miles, both acutely aware of how narrow their escape had been. The encounter with Barton and Jenkins had shaken Thomas to his core. It was one thing to imagine running from the law, another entirely to face it directly. We should avoid the train station, Clara said finally. If there really is an alert out for us, that's the first place they'll look. Thomas nodded in agreement. What's our plan then? Clara's hands tightened on the wheel. We keep driving, take back roads when we can. Make it to Cincinnati by nightfall. After that, we'll figure it out as we go. The miles passed beneath them, each one carrying them further from Crickwater Hollow and closer to an uncertain future. Thomas found himself thinking of Joseph Alderman, the father he'd never known. Would he have been proud of his son now, fleeing like a criminal? Or would he have urged Thomas to stay to face the consequences of his actions? As they approached a small town, Clara suddenly pulled over to the side of the road. "We need to change our appearance," she announced. "If they are looking for us, they'll have descriptions by now." Thomas looked at her in surprise. "How do we do that?" "There's a general store in this town. I'll go in and buy some things, hair dye for you, scissors for me, maybe some different clothes. You wait here with the truck." Before Thomas could protest, Clara was gone, walking briskly toward the cluster of buildings ahead. He waited anxiously, watching the road for any sign of the patrol car or the dark sedan. 20 minutes later, Clara returned with a paper bag clutched in her arms. "Drive to that wooded area up ahead," she directed. "We'll make our changes there, away from prying eyes, in the shelter of a grove of oak trees." Clara unpacked her purchases: a bottle of peroxide, scissors, a man's work shirt and cap for Thomas, a floral-patterned dress and headscarf for herself. "Blonde hair is the furthest from what you have now," she explained, mixing the peroxide. "It'll change your appearance dramatically." As she applied the harsh chemical to his dark hair, Thomas winced at the burning sensation on his scalp. Clara worked methodically, her face set with determination. "My turn," she said when she finished with Thomas. Handing him the scissors, she gathered her long hair into her hand. "Cut it short, just below my ears." Thomas hesitated. "Are you sure?" "Your hair, ... It's just hair," Clara said firmly. "It'll grow back. Right now, we need to look different than the descriptions they'll have of us." With shaking hands, Thomas cut through Clara's hair, watching as the long strands fell to the ground around them. When he finished, she looked years younger, the short bob framing her face in a way that subtly altered her appearance. They changed clothes, Thomas swapping his worn flannel for the new work shirt, Clara trading her familiar house dress for the brighter floral pattern. When they were done, they barely recognized each other. "One last thing," Clara said, pulling out a small jar. "Rouge. I never wear it, so it'll change how I look." She dabbed the red color onto her cheeks and lips, transforming her usually plain appearance into something more vibrant. Thomas stared at his reflection in the truck's side mirror. His hair, still wet with peroxide, was already lightening to a strawberry blonde. With the cap pulled low over his forehead and the new shirt, he looked like a different person entirely. "Will this work?" he asked, uncertain. Clara studied their transformations with a critical eye. "It might buy us some time." "That's all we need, just enough time to get far away from here." As they prepared to continue their journey, Thomas found himself looking back toward the east, toward Crickwater Hollow and everything they'd left behind. Somewhere back there lay the truth of his origins, the body of the man who had claimed to be his father, and a lifetime of secrets now exposed. "We can never go back, can we?" he asked quietly. Clara's newly rouged lips pressed into a thin line. "No, Thomas. That life is over now. All we can do is move forward and try to build something new from the ashes." With one last glance eastward, Thomas turned his face toward the setting sun and whatever future awaited them beyond the horizon. Cincinnati loomed before them as dusk settled over the Ohio River, its buildings silhouetted against the darkening sky. To Thomas, who had never seen anything larger than the county seat, the city seemed impossibly vast and intimidating. Lights winked on across the urban sprawl, creating a constellation of human activity that both beckoned and warned. Clara navigated the unfamiliar streets with tense concentration, consulting the scribbled directions she'd jotted down from memory. "Meredith lives in a neighborhood called Price Hill," she explained, "on the west side of the city. I haven't seen her in almost 20 years, but we exchanged Christmas cards. Last year she mentioned she was still in the same house." Thomas stared out the window at the passing storefronts, the streetcars, the crowds of people going about their evening business, blissfully unaware of the fugitives in their midst. His newly lightened hair felt strange, still damp and sticky from the peroxide. Every time he caught a glimpse of himself in the truck's mirror, he startled at the unfamiliar reflection. "What if she turns us away?" Thomas asked, voicing the fear that had been growing as they approached the city. Clara's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "She won't. Meredith and I were close as girls. She'll help us at least for a night or two." They turned onto a street lined with modest two-story homes, each with a small front yard separated from the sidewalk by low iron fences. Clara slowed the truck, peering at house numbers in the gathering darkness. "There," she said finally, pointing to a narrow house with green shutters and a small porch. "Number 42. She parked the truck across the street, turning off the engine. For a moment they sat in silence, the enormity of their situation settling over them like a physical weight. "What do we tell her?" Thomas asked. Clara stared at the house, where warm light glowed behind curtained windows. "As little as possible. We're visiting. We needed to get away from Crickwater for a while. Nothing about Elias, nothing about what we found in the attic." Thomas nodded, understanding the necessity of the lies even as they added to the burden he carried. They crossed the street together, Clara leading the way up the short path to the front door. Her knock 3 rapid taps, followed by 2 slower ones, seemed to Thomas like a code from another lifetime. Footsteps approached from inside, and then the door opened to reveal a plump woman in her early 50s, her graying hair pulled back in a loose bun. She squinted at them in confusion for a moment before recognition dawned in her eyes. "Clara?" she gasped. "Clara Blackwell? Lord have mercy, is that really you?" Clara managed a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hello, Meredith. It's been a long time." Meredith's gaze shifted to Thomas, taking in his blonde hair and unfamiliar clothes. "And this must be Thomas? Last time I saw you, you were just a baby at Margaret's funeral." Her expression softened with sympathy. "My, how you've grown. The spittin' image of your mother." Thomas felt a jolt at these words. Not his father, his mother. Was the resemblance so strong that even this woman, who had only seen him as an infant, could see Margaret in his features? Please come in, Meredith urged, stepping aside. "What a surprise. I wasn't expecting visitors, especially not family from so far away." They entered a small but tidy living room where a radio played softly in the corner and a half-finished piece of knitting lay on an armchair. The normalcy of the scene, so at odds with the chaos of their day, made Thomas feel suddenly, acutely out of place. "Sit down, both of you," Meredith insisted. "You look exhausted. Let me put on some coffee." As she bustled into the kitchen, Clara and Thomas exchanged glances. This warm welcome was more than they had dared hope for, but it only added to Thomas's guilt. They were bringing danger to this kind woman's doorstep. Meredith returned with a tray of coffee and some hastily arranged cookies. "Now then," she said, settling into her chair. "What brings you all the way to Cincinnati? Not that I'm not delighted to see you, but it's quite a journey from Crickwater Hollow." Clara took a deep breath. "We needed a change of scenery. Things have been difficult lately." Meredith's eyes narrowed slightly. "Difficult how? Is it Elias? I always said my cousin had a mean streak in him wider than the Ohio River." "It's complicated," Clara replied, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "We may need to stay in Cincinnati for a while. I was hoping we could impose on your hospitality for a night or two while we get our bearings." "Of course you can stay," Meredith said without hesitation. "I've got the spare room upstairs and Thomas can take the sofa here. Stay as long as you need." She paused, studying Clara more closely. "Your hair, you cut it, and you're wearing rouge. I've never seen you with either in all the years I've known you." Clara touched her shortened locks self-consciously. "I decided it was time for a change. New city, new look." Meredith didn't seem entirely convinced, but she nodded. "Well, it suits you. Makes you look 10 years younger." Her gaze shifted to Thomas. "And you, young man? Last time Elias wrote, he mentioned you were working in the mine with him. Will you be looking for similar work here?" Thomas exchanged a quick glance with Clara. "I'm not sure yet, ma'am. I might try something different." "Good for you," Meredith said firmly. "No need to follow in those footsteps. Plenty of factory work in Cincinnati, especially with the war effort ramping up. A strong young man like you would be hired in no time." She took a sip of her coffee. "Speaking of Elias, does he know you've come to visit me?" The question hung in the air, loaded with unintended significance. Thomas felt sweat breaking out on his forehead despite the cool evening. "Elias and I aren't on the best of terms right now," Clara said carefully. "He knows we've left, but not specifically where we were headed." Meredith's expression darkened. "He hasn't been hurting you, has he? Either of you? Because if that's why you're here—" "No, nothing like that," Clara interrupted quickly. "Just ... disagreements. About Thomas's future, mainly. Elias wanted him to stay in the mine, but I think the boy deserves more options." The lie came so smoothly that Thomas almost believed it himself. He nodded along, trying to look like a young man caught in a family dispute over his career prospects, rather than a fugitive running from a death that might be ruled murder. Meredith seemed to accept this explanation. "Well, you're both welcome here for as long as you like. Cincinnati's a good city with plenty of opportunities. Maybe this is just what you needed. A fresh start. A fresh start." The words echoed in Thomas's mind as they finished their coffee and made small talk about the city, about Meredith's job as a secretary at an insurance company, about the war in Europe that seemed to be drawing America closer to involvement with each passing day. Later, as Thomas lay on the sofa under a borrowed quilt, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, he wondered what a fresh start really meant. Could he truly begin again, build a life free from the shadows of Crickwater Hollow? Or would the truth of Elias's death and all the secrets that had preceded it follow them wherever they went? Through the thin walls, he could hear Clara and Meredith talking in low voices in the kitchen. He strained to make out their words. Just seemed so sudden, Meredith was saying. Are you sure there isn't more to the story, Clara? I told you everything that matters, Clara replied, her voice tight. We needed to leave, and we did. And the hair? The makeup? The boy's hair's dyed, isn't it? People don't change their appearance like that just for a family disagreement. A pause, then Clara's voice, lower now. Meredith, please. Some things are better left unasked. You're in some kind of trouble, aren't you? Meredith pressed. Is it the law? Because if it is, it's not what you think, Clara interrupted. Thomas is a good boy. He's never done anything wrong. He's just caught in circumstances not of his making. Another pause, longer this time. All right, Meredith said finally. I won't pry. But if there's anything I can do to help anything at all, you'll tell me, won't you? You're already helping more than you know, Clara replied, her voice thick with emotion. Just by taking us in, no questions asked. That's what family does, Meredith said simply. Family. The word stirred something in Thomas's chest. His understanding of family had been shattered in the past 24 hours. The father who wasn't his father. The aunt who had protected him from terrible truths. The mother he'd never known. Yet here was Meredith, offering shelter and support based on bonds of kinship that stretched back decades. As sleep finally began to claim him, Thomas wondered what his real father, Joseph Alderman, would think of him now. Would he understand the choices Thomas had made? Would he forgive the chain of events that had led to Elias's death? These questions followed Thomas into uneasy dreams, where he ran through endless mountain tunnels pursued by shadows with Elias's face in his own eyes. Thomas awoke to the unfamiliar sounds of city morning traffic on the street outside, the neighbor's dog barking, the clatter of dishes from Meredith's kitchen. And for a disorienting moment he couldn't remember where he was or why he wasn't in his bed at home in Crickwater Hollow. Then reality crashed over him in a sickening wave. Elias was dead. They had fled. Everything had changed. He sat up on the sofa, running a hand through his stiff, chemically treated hair. The peroxide had completed its work overnight. His formerly dark locks were now a pale, brassy blonde. Between that and the different clothes, he hardly recognized himself. Maybe that was for the best. Morning, Thomas, Meredith called from the kitchen doorway. Sleep well? Yes, ma'am, he lied, forcing himself to smile. Thank you for letting us stay. Nonsense. Your family. She gestured toward the kitchen. Come have some breakfast. Clara's still asleep. Poor thing looked exhausted. But I've got eggs and toast ready for you. Thomas followed her into the small kitchen, where the morning paper lay open on the table. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the Kentucky section was face up. But a quick scan of the visible headlines revealed nothing about a death in Crickwater Hollow. Of course not, he realized. News traveled slowly from the hollows to the cities. If Elias's body had been discovered yesterday, it might be days before it made the Cincinnati papers, if it made them at all. Meredith set a plate of eggs before him. I was thinking, she said, taking the seat across from him, there's a factory down by the river that's hiring, making parts for military vehicles. The pay is good, and they don't ask too many questions these days, what with the labor shortage. Thomas looked up from his eggs. You think I could get hired? A strong young man like you? Certainly. You're what, 17? 16, Thomas admitted. Meredith waved this away. Tell them you're 18. They won't check too closely, not with orders to fill. The idea of steady work, of establishing themselves in Cincinnati, was appealing. Perhaps they really could start over here, far enough from Crickwater that the shadows of the past couldn't reach them. I'd like that, Thomas said. Thank you. Meredith studied him for a moment. You've got your mother's eyes, you know. Margaret was always the pretty one of the family. Clara and I used to be so jealous of her. Thomas set down his fork. Did you know my mother well? We were cousins, but not particularly close, Meredith replied. She was younger than me by quite a bit. I remember her as a bright, lively girl. Always reading, always full of dreams about leaving the mountains someday. She sighed. Such a tragedy, her dying so young. At least she had you first. Thomas felt a familiar ache at the mention of the mother he'd never known. Aunt Clara doesn't talk about her much. I'm not surprised. It hit Clara hard, losing her sister like that. And then to raise you herself with only Elias for help, ... Meredith shook her head. Clara's stronger than she looks. Thomas wanted to ask more about Margaret, about the family history, but Clara appeared in the doorway just then, her newly shortened hair sticking up at odd angles. Good morning, she said, her voice husky with sleep. I hope we didn't impose too much, Meredith. Not at all, Meredith assured her. I was just telling Thomas about a factory that's hiring, thought he might want to apply. Claire's eyes widened slightly. That sounds permanent. Well, you did say you might stay in Cincinnati for a while, Meredith pointed out. A job would give the boys something to do, some money coming in. Unless you've got other plans? Thomas could see Clara struggling with the implications. Taking a job meant putting down roots, however tentative. It meant committing to their new identities, to the lies they'd told, to a future built on the foundations of what they'd fled. It's worth considering, Clara said finally. But we shouldn't rush into anything. Maybe we should get our bearings first, see what the city has to offer. Meredith nodded, though Thomas could see disappointment in her eyes. Of course. Take your time. You're welcome to stay as long as you need. After breakfast, Thomas offered to help with the dishes while Clara borrowed Meredith's bathroom to freshen up. As he dried a plate, he noticed Meredith casting sidelong glances at him. Something on your mind, ma'am? He asked quietly. Meredith hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. Thomas, I want you to know that whatever trouble you and Clara are in, you can trust me. I sense there's more to your story than a simple family disagreement. Thomas nearly dropped the plate. I don't know what you mean. The dyed hair, the sudden appearance without warning, the way Clara keeps looking out the window like she's expecting someone to be following you. Meredith placed a wet cup in the drying rack. Not a fool, Thomas. Something happened back in Crickwater, something serious enough to make you run. Thomas stared at the dish towel in his hands, unable to meet her eyes. We can't talk about it, he said finally. Hey, it's better if you don't know. To his surprise, Meredith nodded. I understand. But remember, secrets have a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you try to bury them. Whatever you're running from, it might be better to face it than to spend your life looking over your shoulder. Before Thomas could respond, Clara returned, her face freshly washed, wearing a borrowed dress from Meredith that altered her appearance even further from the woman she'd been in Crickwater. Meredith, would you mind if Thomas and I borrowed your truck for a bit? She asked. I thought we might drive around, get familiar with the city. Take it, Meredith said, handing over the keys. I'm not going anywhere today. There's a map in the glove compartment if you need it. As they drove through Cincinnati's bustling streets, Clara remained silent, her expression tense. Thomas waited until they were several blocks from Meredith's house before speaking. She knows we're running from something, he said. She won't press for details, but she knows. Clara nodded grimly. I figured as much. Meredith always was perceptive. She turned down a quieter side street and pulled over. Thomas, we need to talk about what happens next. Are we staying in Cincinnati? Clara stared through the windshield, her fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel. I don't know. It's close enough to Kentucky that news might reach here. If they find Elias and suspect foul play, then we go further, Thomas said. West, like you said. California. With what money? Clara countered. We have barely enough to last a week, even staying with Meredith. Train tickets to California would take everything we have. Thomas leaned back against the seat, the magnitude of their situation sinking in. They were essentially penniless fugitives, dependent on the goodwill of a relative who was already suspicious of their sudden appearance. I could take that factory job, he suggested. Save up money. In a few weeks we'd have enough to move on. Clara considered this. It's risky. The longer we stay in one place, the more chance someone recognizes us. We look different now, Thomas pointed out. And nobody knows us here. I could use a different name at the factory. Joseph, maybe. The thought of using his real father's name gave him a strange comfort, as if somehow connecting to the man he'd never known. Clara's expression softened at the mention of the name. Joseph, she repeated quietly. He would have been so proud of you, Thomas. Not of what happened with Elias, no one could be proud of that, but of who you've become despite everything. You have his strength, his determination. Thomas felt a lump forming in his throat. Tell me more about him, please, Clara sighed, turning off the engine and settling back. Joseph Alderman was the youngest of 5 boys. His father died in the mine when Joseph was just 7, and his mother raised them all on a seamstress's wages. Joseph was smart, so smart the schoolteacher begged his mother to let him continue past 8th grade. But they needed the money he could earn in the mine. She smiled faintly at the memory, but he never stopped learning. Read everything he could get his hands on. Had beautiful handwriting, too clear and elegant, not what you'd expect from a miner's rough hands. He used to write poems for Margaret, nothing fancy but heartfelt. How did they meet? Thomas asked, hungry for every detail of his parents' story. At church, of all places. Margaret was home from school for the summer. Joseph was singing in the choir. He had a lovely tenor voice. After the service, Margaret complimented his singing, and that was that. They started meeting secretly by Crickwater Creek every chance they got. Thomas tried to picture this, his mother, young and beautiful, meeting his father by the creek. Their lives still full of possibility, neither knowing the tragedy that awaited them. Your grandfather would have disowned Margaret if he'd known she was seeing a miner, Clara continued. But she didn't care. She said Joseph was worth any sacrifice. Her voice caught. They were going to elope that November, had it all planned out. Then the mine collapse happened in October. And Joseph died, Thomas finished quietly. Clara nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Margaret was devastated. And then to discover she was expecting you, it was both a blessing and a terrible burden. She knew what it would mean for her reputation, for her future. That's when she came to you. Yes, I was already living with Elias by then. He'd built the house after our parents died, and I kept house for him. I never imagined he would ... double quotes. She trailed off, unable to finish. Force her to marry him, Thomas applied, the words bitter on his tongue. Clara wiped away a tear. Elias had always been controlling, even as a boy. But I never thought he could be so cruel. When he discovered Margaret was pregnant, something twisted in him. He saw an opportunity to possess something beautiful, something he'd never been able to have on his own. Thomas felt sick thinking about it. Elias forcing his mother into marriage, using Clara as leverage. And no one suspected anything? People talked, of course. The timing of the wedding and your birth raised eyebrows. But Elias was respected in the community, and Margaret was, well, she became very quiet after the marriage, kept to herself. People assumed she was grieving Joseph in private while making the best of her situation, and then she died having me. Clara reached over and took Thomas's hand. Her last words were about you. She made me promise to protect you, to make sure you knew how much she wanted you, how much she loved you already. Her voice broke. I've tried, Thomas. All these years I've tried to keep that promise. Thomas squeezed her hand, his own vision blurring with tears. You have, Aunt Clara. You've been the only real parent I've ever had. They sat in silence for a moment, both lost in the bittersweet memories of a woman Thomas had never known but whose legacy had shaped his entire life. Finally, Clara straightened, wiping her eyes. We should get back. Meredith will wonder where we've gone. As they drove back toward Meredith's house, Thomas made a decision. I'll take the factory job, he said firmly. We'll stay in Cincinnati for a while, save money, then decide what to do next. Maybe ... Maybe news of Elias will reach us here and we'll know whether it's safe to stay or if we need to move on. Clara nodded slowly. All right, but we need to be careful, Thomas. Very careful. When they returned, Meredith was sitting in her living room, the radio playing softly as she mended a pair of stockings. She looked up as they entered, her expression unreadable. Find your way around, all right? She asked. Yes, thank you, Clara replied. Cincinnati is quite a city. Meredith set aside her mending. While you were out, I had a visitor. Sheriff came by asking questions about new folks in the neighborhood. Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. Clara froze beside him, her face draining of color. Said they're looking for 2 people from Kentucky, Meredith continued, her eyes never leaving their faces. A woman and her nephew. Apparently there was a death down in the hollows, and these 2 disappeared right after. The silence in the room was deafening. Thomas couldn't breathe, couldn't think. They'd been found already. Somehow they'd been tracked to Cincinnati, to Meredith's very doorstep. What did you tell him? Clara whispered finally. Meredith's expression remained neutral. I told him I hadn't seen anyone matching that description. That I live alone and don't get many visitors, especially not from Kentucky. Thomas stared at her in disbelief. You lied to the sheriff? For us? I told him what I felt was right, Meredith replied evenly. Now, I think it's time you told me the truth. All of it. Because next time that sheriff comes around and I need to know exactly what I'm hiding. Clara and Thomas sat side by side on Meredith's sofa, the weight of their secrets finally laid bare between them. Meredith occupied the armchair across from them, her face grave as she absorbed everything they had told her. The discovery in the attic, the confrontation with Elias, the fatal fall, their desperate flight. Lord have mercy, she murmured when they finished. So Elias wasn't really Thomas's father at all? No, Clara confirmed. Joseph Alderman was. Elias forced Margaret to marry him to hide her pregnancy, to save her reputation, though in truth, I think he just wanted to possess her. Meredith shook her head slowly. I always knew there was something not right about Elias, even when we were children. He had a meanness in him, a need to control. She looked at Thomas. And you say you didn't push him? He fell during the struggle? Thomas nodded, the moment replaying in his mind for the 100th time. I charged at him to keep him from burning my mother's letters. He lost his balance at the top of the stairs. He swallowed hard. But I'd be lying if I said I was sorry he fell. The sheriff who came by, Clara asked anxiously, did he say how they found Elias, what they're thinking? Only that there'd been a death and 2 people had disappeared right after, Meredith replied. But he mentioned they'd been seen driving north early that morning. Someone must have reported seeing you on the road, Mueller Thomas said. The miner we passed at dawn. He must have mentioned it when they found Elias. How did they know to look for us here in Cincinnati? Clara wondered. Meredith grimaced. The sheriff mentioned they were checking with known relatives of the Blackwells in neighboring states. My name must have come up. The realization that they'd been so easily tracked sent a chill through Thomas. The authorities were closer than they'd imagined, the net tightening around them with frightening speed. What happens now? He asked, looking from Clara to Meredith. We can't stay here if they're checking relatives. No, you can't, Meredith agreed. But running isn't the answer either, not anymore. Clara stiffened beside Thomas. What are you suggesting? Meredith leaned forward, her expression earnest. You need to go back and face this, both of you. Tell the truth about what happened. It was an accident during a confrontation, not murder. They'll never believe that, Thomas argued. Not with us running away right after. Not with all the suspicion that's always surrounded us in Crickwater. Running makes you look guilty, Meredith countered. The longer you stay gone, the worse it gets. If you come back voluntarily, explain about the letters, about Margaret and Joseph, about the confrontation, there's a chance people will understand. Clara shook her head vehemently. You don't know what it's like in the Hollows, Meredith. They've been waiting for years for proof that Thomas isn't Elias's son. This would confirm every whisper, every sidelong glance. And with Elias dead at the bottom of the stairs after Thomas confronted him, they'll call it murder, accident or not. A heavy silence fell over the room as the three of them confronted the impossible situation. Stay and be discovered by the authorities. Run and look even more guilty. Return voluntarily and face potentially devastating consequences. There might be another way, Meredith said finally. A way to control the narrative, to make sure your side of the story is heard before judgment is passed. How? Thomas asked. My brother-in-law is a lawyer in Lexington, James Hargrove. He specializes in criminal defense. If you went to him first, told him everything, he could accompany you when you turn yourselves in. Make sure your rights are protected, that the full story comes out. Clara's brow furrowed. Would he take our case? Given the circumstances? James is a good man. He believes everyone deserves a fair chance, especially those the system is stacked against. Meredith hesitated. There's something else to consider. War is coming, Thomas. Everyone knows America will be in it before long. Young men who enlist ... The courts tend to look favorably on them. Thomas understood immediately what she was suggesting. Join the army, and they might go easier on me. It's been known to happen, Meredith confirmed, especially in cases where there are mitigating circumstances. No, Clara said firmly, absolutely not. I didn't protect Thomas all these years just to send him off to die in Europe. It might be his best chance, Clara, Meredith argued gently. Better than spending years in prison. Or worse. Thomas felt a strange calm settling over him as he considered the options. Running had seemed the only choice in the immediate aftermath of Elias's death. But now, with the authorities already closing in, perhaps facing the consequences was the braver path. And the idea of serving in the military, of doing something meaningful, something his real father might have been proud of, held a certain appeal. I think Meredith's right, he said quietly. We can't keep running. Sooner or later they'll find us. Better to face this on our terms than theirs. Clara looked at him with anguish. Thomas, you don't understand what you're saying. If they convict you, and if they don't, he countered. If the lawyer helps us tell the truth and people believe it, then we're free. Truly free. No more looking over our shoulders, no more running from the past. Before Clara could respond, a sharp knock at the front door made them all freeze. Meredith rose, motioning for Thomas and Clara to stay where they were. Who is it? She called through the door. Sheriff Donovan, ma'am. I'd like to ask you a few more questions, if you don't mind. Meredith turned back to Thomas and Clara, her expression urgent. Go out the back, she whispered. Take my truck. The keys are in my purse in the kitchen. Drive to Lexington. James's office is on Main Street, Hargrove and Associates. I'll stall the sheriff as long as I can. Clara hesitated. Meredith, we can't ask you to lie for us again. You're not asking. I'm offering. Meredith straightened her dress. Now go, quickly. And when you see James, tell him his sister-in-law sent you. He'll understand. Thomas grabbed Clara's hand, pulling her toward the kitchen as Meredith moved to answer the door. They slipped out the back just as they heard the front door opening, the sheriff's deep voice drifting through the house. Moments later, they were in Meredith's truck, Thomas behind the wheel, speeding away from the small house on the quiet Cincinnati street. In the rearview mirror, Thomas caught a glimpse of a police car parked in front, a uniformed officer standing on Meredith's porch. We're doing the right thing, Thomas said, more to convince himself than Clara. Going to the lawyer, facing this head-on. It's what Joseph would have done. Clara said nothing, her face turned toward the window, but Thomas saw her hand move to the small pocket of her borrowed dress, where he knew she had placed the few precious letters from his mother that they had managed to bring with them. The last tangible connection to Margaret and Joseph, to the truth of who Thomas really was. As they drove toward Lexington and whatever fate awaited them there, Thomas thought about the intertwined paths that had led to this moment: his mother's forbidden love for a coal miner, Elias's cruel manipulation, Clara's years of silent protection, and his own sudden, violent awakening to the truth. Born as both nephew and son, raised in shadows and secrets, he was finally emerging into the light of his own identity. Whatever happened next, whether justice or punishment awaited him, at least he would face it knowing who he truly was. Not Elias Blackwell's son, but the child of Margaret and Joseph Alderman, born of love rather than coercion, carrying within him the best of both his real parents. The road stretched before them, winding through the autumn-painted Kentucky hills toward Lexington, toward a reckoning long overdue, toward the truth with all its terrible and liberating power. Thomas gripped the steering wheel tighter and drove on.